This next chapter is called The Fastest Horse in Town. At Kaga Street, Laura turned left and passed directly in front of the Todd house. Men were still posted there, near the front and rear entrances. Joel had the window to the right of the porch wide open and was leaning out so far that he was in danger of falling into the bed of zinnias below. His hair was tousled by the wind, and his eyes were snapping with excitement. Although Laura was only a few feet from him, he seemed to pay no attention to her. His eyes were on the crowd up the street. Thus ignored, Laura hurried by with burning cheeks. She wished she knew why he had failed to greet her. Was it because he didn't want the guard at the front door to know they were acquainted? Or couldn't he forgive her for her southern sympathies? Perhaps, she thought sadly, they would never again be friends. Across the street, on the southeast corner of Kaga and 5th Streets, stood the Presbyterian Church. It was built of stone and was quite imposing with its bell tower and its front portico with 4 graceful columns. 2 large front doors at either end of the porch were closed, and several men stood before them, holding off the crowd that filled the lawn and overflowed onto the road in front of the building. "Set him free!" shouted a man. At once the call was repeated by many voices. "Set him free!" Again, Laura was turned by conflicting emotions. All these people were concerned over one black man. They had stopped whatever they were doing to come and look at him and try to keep him from being sent back down south. Yesterday, she couldn't have understood this, but now she knew Martin, and that made all the difference in the world. Before, she had thought of slaves as property belonging to plantation owners such as Uncle Jim. But now, because of Martin, she knew that slaves were people, and it was only right that a person should have the chance to live a life of his own. No one should own a person. At the right of the church, 2 boys were taking turns boosting each other up so they could see into a small window that was an inch or 2 ajar. As she watched, she saw an angry sheriff's deputy chase them away. Laughing, the boys ran down the slope. Laura scurried after them, and panting, she asked, "Did you see him?" "Who?" asked the elder of the 2 boys. "The runaway. I just saw him a minute." "What does he look like?" "Black," said the boy. He exchanged a friend with his glance and laughed. "He looks like any black man. They all look alike." Laura felt indignant. The very idea, seeing that all black people looked alike. You might as well say all white people looked alike. They were thin or fat or old, or they were young like Martin and had big eyes that could look scared or merry or grateful. Something was happening on the porch of the church. Shouts and a sound of scuffling reached her ears, but from where she stood, she couldn't see what was going on. The few people who were not already crowded around the front porch of the church hurried to get there. Laura was about to go up the hill again when she noticed a man wearing a deputy's badge slip quietly into a small side door near the rear of the church. Less than a minute later, he came out, leading a tall, slim black dressed in a shabby blue shirt and tan pants. Behind him was another deputy. At the same moment, a carriage came hurtling down 5th Street from the direction of town. One glance told Laura that it was the Eastman carriage drawn by Sally, galloping for all she was worth. Down the hill she came, directly towards Laura, who stood speechless and motionless. Someone pushed her roughly back against the wall of the church. Afterward, she couldn't say whether it was one of the deputies or the black man who had shoved her to safety. But confused though she was, she looked hard at the 2 men in the carriage. One she had never seen before, but the other was a black-bearded man who had been in Josiah Tyrant's tailor shop. The black-bearded man, who had the reins, shouted to Sally and pulled her to a halt. He reached out of the carriage, seized the black man by the wrist, and hoisted him up onto the carriage beside him. With a crack of the whip, the carriage was off again, continuing down the hill even faster than before. Someone in the crowd in front of the church shouted, "There he goes!" 2 men, both of whom Laura recognized as being among the slave hunters who had come to the house looking for Martin, leaped into a carriage and took chase. Laura doubted they could catch up, for the first carriage had a long head start, and Sally, as Bert had said, was the fastest horse in town. One of the deputies who had been with the black man disappeared into the church, but a crowd quickly gathered around the other deputy. Laura, with her back against the rough stone wall of the church, found she couldn't leave unless she were to push her way through the horde of men. Timidly, she remained where she was, getting more and more uncomfortable and uneasy. What happened? Why'd you let him go? A man asked the deputy. The deputy seemed as puzzled as Laura. We were going to move him over to the sheriff's house for safekeeping. You never can tell what might happen with a crowd like this, and we didn't want anybody getting hurt. Next thing we knew, that carriage came down the hill, and a fellow grabbed the fugitive and took off with him. You should have had him handcuffed to you. Sounds to me like you didn't put up much of a fight. To Laura's dismay, the slave hunter named Walt joined the group. We're going to get to the bottom of this, he declared. I think you had this all set up. We were going to take him to the courthouse in Lockport as soon as we could, protested the deputy. We want justice done, same as you. I don't like your idea of justice, Walt snarled. As the deputy started to walk away, Walt reached out to seize him, but several of the local citizens came quietly between the two men, giving the deputy time to escape. Laura, seeing an opening, edged away from the wall of the church and started up the hill. She had taken only a few steps when Walt blocked her. Miss Eastman, what do you know about this? He demanded. You were down here when it happened. I saw you. Nothing, she stammered. That was your horse and carriage. I'd know it anywhere. Who was in that carriage? She insisted. I don't know. She tried to get around him, but as quickly as a cat, he leaped in front of her again. Walt glared at her. You're no Southerner. You're just like everybody else in this town, ready to break the law. Let me go, Laura cried out. I'm not through with you yet. Laura was close to despair. The crowd was scattering, and no one seemed to pay any attention to her. Then she saw Bert coming towards him. He had never looked as good to her as he did at that moment. She ducked wildly around Walt and ran to her brother. Bert growled, You leave my sister alone. And to Laura's surprise, Walt backed away. It couldn't be afraid that he was afraid of a tall, thin 13-year-old. It must be that he had seen the sheriff coming down the church steps and realized he would get no sympathy from that source. Bert took Laura's elbow and said quietly, Let's go. That was our carriage, she whispered, still trembling. I know it. Bert sounded impatient, and so does everybody else. Everyone in this town knows Sally. Wait till Pa hears about this. We'll really be in trouble. He looked accusingly at Laura. Why didn't you stay in the carriage? I wanted to see if it was Martin. I had just as much a right to look as you did. Bert dropped the subject. I wish I knew who was in that carriage. One of the men was that fellow we saw in Mr. Tyron's shop today, the man with the black beard. Is that so? Well, Bert looked hopeful. I wonder. What do you wonder? Bert glanced around to see if anyone was near them. That man might be connected with the Underground Railroad. Of course, it was someone from the Underground, said Laura positively. Who else would steal a fugitive away? Some of the slave catchers might. It's the fellow who takes a slave down south gets the bounty. A carriage drawn by a sturdy black horse came up beside them. The sheriff leaned out. Do you and your sister need a ride home, Bert? Thanks, we sure do. As they traveled out the ridge road toward home, Laura couldn't help smiling to herself as she tried to guess what Mrs. Finch would think if she saw them being taken home by the sheriff. When he stopped in front of the Eastman house, the sheriff said, Don't worry about your horse and carriage. I'm sure we'll get them back to you. Laura wondered how he could be so positive.